The regime in Iran has existed only for the past few days and weeks. Could changes in Iran weaken Putin's war effort? We'll talk about this with Andreas Umland, analyst at the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies in the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Andreas, glad to see you, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me again.
Another terrorist attack by Russia on Ukraine's energy sector has taken place. The primary targets of the strikes were once again energy infrastructure facilities, including power generation, sites and substations. The attacks caused significant damage to residential and civilian infrastructure. The regions affected include Dnipropetrovsk, Zhytomyr, Zaporizhzhia, Kyiv, Odessa, Sumy, Kharkiv and Donetsk. How can the international community help Ukraine strengthen its energy security in the long term? Not only are there any coordinated military or technical support measures from allied countries to prevent further damage? Your thoughts?
Well, there are such measures, but there are too little too late. And there is already a lot of help going on in terms of directly helping Ukraine to restore the damaged energy infrastructure, and also for the protection of the infrastructure with anti-aircraft systems. But there is no strategic solution to that, and the cooperation concerning long-range Ukrainian weaponry that could hit the places from where the drones and the missiles are being launched towards Ukraine. This cooperation is only starting now to enable Ukraine to do that, and some of the key such missiles that could have been deployed or could have been given to Ukraine, such as the German Taurus missile or the American Tomahawk cruise missile, are not here. I'm myself in Kyiv now. And what is also not being implemented is a plan that has been circulating already for almost 4 years now, namely to create air protection zones over Ukraine and to protect then especially the energy infrastructure, not only with Ukrainian anti-aircraft missiles and interceptor planes, but also with Western interceptor planes that could be deployed to Ukraine to shoot down missiles and drones that are flying into this energy infrastructures. That is also already an old idea that has not been implemented, although there would be many reasons why this could have been done, and it would not have killed any Russian soldiers. It would have not meant any direct confrontation between Russia and the countries that would be sending such planes to help Ukraine to protect itself. But it's not done, and now we see the results of that.
Unfortunately, Andreas, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine has confirmed strikes on an enterprise in Taganrog. The targeted facility was Atlant Aero, a company that carries out the full cycle of design, production and testing of strike and reconnaissance UAVs of the Molniya type, as well as components for Orion UAVs. Ukraine is using its own capabilities. But what about Europe and the United States? You mentioned Tomahawk missiles. And why are Ukrainian partners reluctant to provide long-range strike capabilities? What political or security concerns are preventing allies from supplying long-range weapons to Ukraine now?
It depends, and it's different from country to country. So in Germany, I'm myself German, the problem is public opinion, that the Russian propaganda has managed to persuade a majority of Germans that the delivery of Taurus cruise missiles to Ukraine would drag Germany into this war, that Russia would start bombing then Germany. With the American Tomahawk missiles, I think it's a different story. I don't think that this sort of broad fear is the most important factor here, but rather a different political preference in the White House and this sort of friendship between Trump and Putin, and the general, I would say, incompetence of the US administration that came into power last year concerning foreign affairs, and these, at the end, ridiculous so far, at least attempts to negotiate a ceasefire that was always, I think, doomed under the preconditions under it is still being attempted until this day. So it depends from country to country. Germany is now trying to compensate this non-delivery of the Taurus missiles with cooperation with the Ukrainian military-industrial complex. Great Britain has delivered its Storm Shadow missiles, but is also at the same time helping Ukraine to develop a ballistic missile. France has delivered a certain amount of its Scalp cruise missiles, but that is, as I said, too little, too late, and Ukraine is doing what it can with its own equipment, but it's not enough.
Not enough, but we see also that the case seeks to develop ballistic missiles for Ukraine capable of reaching Moscow, and we are waiting for this. Andreas, increasing economic pressure on Russia combined with support for Ukrainians' efforts on the battlefield could force the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin to seek peace, as he is already compelled to shift the primary burden of financing the war onto the population. The Russian people are paying for Putin's priorities as banks transfer all the consequences of credit pressure onto them. The civilian sector is also suffering due to a labor shortage and a crisis in average wages in Russia. How is increasing economic pressure on Russia affecting its ability to sustain the war in Ukraine? How can international sanctions or economic measures influence Russia's decision-making?
Last year, we have finally seen significant effects of the sanctions that have been so far imposed. There were also effects before, and the Russian war against Ukraine would have been much more successful without the sanctions that have been imposed since 2022. But these sanctions then were not enough. That's the same story with the military support, and were only gradually increased. And then there was also this effect on the Russian economy that the enormous orders for military equipment and investment in the military-industrial complex have led to a sort of artificial growth of the Russian economy. This has now come to an end, and the Russian economy is now entering much more difficult times, and also the budgetary situation in Russia is changing. But maybe the resoluteness that we now see of Russia to use this terror campaign to come to some sort of victorious peace for Russia is exactly a result of this of these economic problems and of the inability to solve the issue. And so they militarily, and so they want to use it, solve it by terroristic means. But obviously, the sanctions could be much harsher. The Russian Federation has managed to circumvent many of the sanctions with the help of such countries as China and India, and so the economy is still working. But there are many instruments that have not been used, and also many of the sanctions that have been introduced are not implemented consistently, and Russia is then able to find loopholes and to basically keep the economy running.
The European Union plans to adopt its 20th package of sanctions against Russia by February 24, 2026, marking the 4th anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. What impact is the new sanctions package expected to have on Russia's economy and war capabilities, in your opinion?
Well, hopefully it will have a stronger impact. There is also a learning process going on in Brussels in that the bureaucrats and the politicians are better now calibrating the sanctions so as to hit the most vulnerable points of the Russian economy and budget. But we've seen in earlier sanctions rounds that Russia has managed then often to circumvent the sanctions, to neutralize them, to compensate for them. And that is, of course, the fear here as well, that there will be new sanctions, and there have been already these 19 sanctions packages, but the effect is limited. As I said, it's now visible, the effect much more visible than in 2022 and 2023, but the economy is not yet in such dire situation that Putin would feel an urge to actually go for a sensible compromise in the negotiations.
The United Kingdom is preparing for potential strikes against Russia's shadow fleet and other Russian vessels. A draft law is currently being developed that would authorize British military forces to use weapons against them, the Telegraph reports. How could potential UK strikes against Russia's shadow fleet affect Russia's economy and oil exports? What impact would such actions have on Russia's ability to finance its war efforts?
That sounds to me like a good idea, and what is here perhaps the main idea is behind it is not so much to actually use these weapons against the shadow fleet tankers, but rather to increase the risk for using these ships and for helping Russia to circumvent the sanctions, and thereby to make these shipments more and more unsustainable and less profitable for Russia, so that eventually this shadow fleet will not function anymore as a source of income for Russia, because the premiums for the insurance would increase and the risks would increase, and fewer companies would agree to help Russia in these operations. We'll see what this will then eventually mean and what will actually come out of it. But the shadow fleet is, of course, a major instrument of Russia to circumvent the sanctions and then to get its oil sold and then to generate this way income for its budget with which the war is then financed.
What about the United States? Because the US has promised to intercept every shadow fleet ship transporting Venezuelan oil.
Well, that is also good, I would say, and it is something that should be an example for other countries and also for other action by the United States beyond the Venezuelan context. The operation in Venezuela of the US is certainly dubious in many ways and violates international law. On the other hand, it has also changed the international economic situation, in that now these enormous resources of Venezuelan oil are de facto under US control, and that constrains the ability of countries like Russia and China and so on to act, because Venezuelan oil has played a certain role in all of that. There was this scheme of mixing Venezuelan oil with Russian oil, and China also has an obvious interest in Venezuelan oil. So we'll see how this will then impact the overall economic situation. But the main theater of action is actually in Europe, and is rather the Baltic Sea or the Black Sea, where much of the Russian oil trade is going on, perhaps also in the Pacific, but what is happening in Venezuela certainly changes the overall international economic situation.
Andreas, you mentioned China. About India. Germany aims to deepen security cooperation with India in order to reduce New Delhi's dependence on Moscow. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz made this statement during a meeting with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. It is noted that for this purpose, the two countries have signed a memorandum of understanding. How could closer security cooperation, and not only security, between Germany and India affect Russia's influence in the region?
If that really happens, so far these are mainly plans that could indeed be important. The diplomatic and political and perhaps also an economic investment of countries like Germany in India, I think makes in so far sense in that India is a democracy. It's not part of this informal alliance or partly formal alliance between China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, authoritarian, autocratic countries that are not united by any sort of civilizational ties. The famous clash of civilization formula developed in the 1990s by Samuel Huntington does not work here. But they are united by their political orders, domestic political orders. That is what makes them cooperate. And India is somewhat different here. It's also not an ideal democracy, but it has a different identity and a more democratic internal political order. So maybe with India there are far better chances to actually build a cooperation with a large Asian partner than there is with China, that has and is still being also tried to come to a better relation with China, but the Chinese political order and also the foreign ambitions are such that this is perhaps at the end of the day senseless. Whereas with India, I think these attempts make sense.
Andreas, and of course, our attention is focused on what is happening in Iran, and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz hopes that a peaceful resolution can be found to end the conflict in Iran. At the same time, the violence against protesters is a sign of the impending collapse of the Ayatollah regime. Merz stated during his visit to India. What signs indicate that the Ayatollah regime may be approaching collapse?
Well, there have been already demonstrations for many years. I think one of the main factors here in all of this is the generational, in that there is now an older generation, a traditional generation in power that does not understand the modern world, and the majority of Iranians are rather young. And this particular conflict here is perhaps above all about this generational gap. And it's also an illustration of how, at the end of the day, unstable authoritarian regimes are. There are exceptions like the North Korean regime, but these authoritarian regimes are typically stable for a while, and then they become unstable because they cannot actually respond adequately to the challenges in the domestic sphere, in economics, in international sphere. And what we see here now is something that we see often, that at some point then these authoritarian regimes, they collapse, and the suffering here is then not only for the people of the regime, but for the whole country. That is sad. But now also this partner of Russia seems to be disappearing.
And really, we see that over the past few years, Iran has sold Russia missiles and drones worth several $billions to assist Kremlin leader, dictator Vladimir Putin in his war against Ukraine. So how would a collapse of the Iranian regime affect Russia? Could political change in Iran significantly weaken Putin's ability to sustain the war against Ukraine?
I think the main impact, so to say, of Iran on this war was in the early phase of the full-scale invasion, in that then indeed Iran provided this critical technology, these Shahed drones, and which were then taken over basically by Russia and developed further. I'm afraid that right now the fallout, the material fallout of a collapse of the Iranian regime on the Russian economy and the Russian ability to conduct the war against Ukraine will be limited. As far as I know, the dependency is here not that large. There was a certain dependency in the early time of the year, but not any longer. So symbolically, politically, it would be a clear loss for Putin and yet another embarrassment after the fall of Assad's regime in Syria, after the disappearance of Maduro from Venezuela. But the immediate impact on the Russian economy or on the Russian-Ukrainian war will, I suspect, be limited.
Mr. Umland, thank you so much for this important and interesting conversation. Thanks for supporting Ukraine and Ukrainian people. Andreas Umland, analyst at the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies in the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, was with us today. Please share this interview and continue supporting Ukraine. Glad to see you and see you.
Thanks for having me.